before the sun rises, the world lies silent beneath a shroud of white. The snow stretches endlessly across the land, untouched and pure, a fragile layer separating life from death. The air is motionless, so cold that even the breath of the earth seems frozen in place. Somewhere in the distance, a faint crack echoes, the sound of ice shifting under its own weight. And then, silence returns, swallowing everything. In that frozen stillness, a small flicker of orange light glows from the mouth of the cave. Inside, life stirs. Deep in the shadows of that cave, a tribe of early humans huddles close around a dying fire. Their bodies are wrapped in animal furs, their faces hidden behind tangled beards and soot. The flames cast trembling shapes upon the walls, moving shadows that look like spirits dancing across the stone. No one speaks. Each person listens to the rhythm of the night outside, the distant howl of a wolf, the slow sigh of wind crawling over the frozen valley. They wait, as they always do, for the first light of dawn before venturing out. To step on fresh snow before sunrise was more than a superstition. It was a rule of survival. The darkness before dawn was when the cold reached its sharpest, when predators still hunted by scent and sound, and when the snow, thin and newly fallen, hid dangers beneath. To walk then was to risk the unknown, to sink into unseen cracks in the ice, to meet eyes glowing in the dark, or to vanish into the silence that had already claimed so many before. A young hunter, barely more than a boy, stirs near the fire. He glances toward the cave mouth, where faint blue light hints at the coming day. His fingers tighten around a wooden spear, its tip hardened by flame. He is restless. Hunger has gnawed at the group for days, and the last scraps of dried meat were shared the night before. The tribe's leader, an old man with a heavy brow and a thick beard streaked with ash, notices the boy's impatience. Without a word, he reaches out and presses a hand on the boy's arm, shaking his head slowly. The message is clear. Not yet. Outside, the snow glows faintly under the pale light of the moon. Each crystal reflects the night's final hours like a sea of frozen stars. The world beyond the cave is both beautiful and cruel, a masterpiece of ice sculpted by the wind and time. The tribe has learned that beauty means nothing when the cold can kill in moments. They wait because waiting means survival. They wait because patience is the only weapon they have against the world that wants them gone. The old man closes his eyes and listens. His hearing is sharp. He knows the sounds of night as if they are voices he can understand. The snow creaks in the distance, not from the wind, but from something moving. Maybe a wolf pack stalking low through the drifts. Maybe a lone bear returning to its den. In the darkness, the difference is the line between life and death. He reaches for a glowing ember, feeding it a small stick, nursing the flame to keep it alive. The faint crackle feels like a heartbeat, the only sign that warmth still exists in this frozen age. The air inside the cave tastes of smoke, earth, and breath. Each exhale hangs in the air like mist before vanishing. The tribe's children sleep under a pile of furs, their faces buried, unaware of the waiting that fills the air. Beside them, women grind remnants of frozen roots into a paste, hoping to stretch what little they have left. Their movements are slow, deliberate, not from laziness but conservation. In the Ice Age, even energy is a precious resource. The boy looks again toward the cave's mouth. Outside, faint light is spreading. Not yet sunlight, but the soft gray of approaching dawn. The snow glimmers differently now, less blue, more silver. The darkness begins to weaken. The boy imagines stepping into that light, leaving the safety of fire for the hunger that calls him. He imagines finding tracks of a reindeer herd, or catching sight of a rabbit against the snow. But he knows what the old man knows. Before sunrise, the world belongs to the beasts. Minutes feel like hours. The quiet hum of survival fills the space between heartbeats. Then, finally, the first pale line of gold appears over the horizon. It's faint at first, so soft it could be mistaken for a trick of the eyes, but soon the sky begins to change. Blue melts into gray, gray into amber. The The snow outside catches the light and glows as if it were burning. Inside the cave, faces lift toward the entrance. The old man exhales slowly, nodding once. The waiting is over. The boy rises, his body stiff from the cold. He grips his spear and steps carefully toward the mouth of the cave. The air bites his face, sharp and dry. The first step outside is always a ceremony, silent but sacred. He lowers his head and studies the ground. The snow is smooth, untouched, a perfect sheet. He hesitates, as if aware that the moment carries weight beyond hunger or need. The tribe watches silently from behind him, the firelight flickering against their faces. And then, as the first ray of sunlight touches the world, the boy lifts his foot and presses it into the snow. The sound is soft, a muted crunch, almost musical. It's the sound of morning beginning again. Steam rises from his breath as he steps forward, the golden light catching the frost in his hair. Behind him, the old man murmurs something in a low, ancient voice, a prayer or perhaps a reminder that every step into the light is both a risk and a gift. The landscape outside is revealed in full color now, a world of shadows retreating, of life slowly waking. Birds burst from frozen branches, their calls slicing through the silence. Far away, the shape of a mammoth moves like a ghost through the mist. The snow glows under the new sun, every footprint a reminder that the tribe has survived one more night. The boy stands at the edge of the ridge, looking over the endless white. For a brief moment, everything feels still, the air, the earth, even time itself. Behind him, the tribe begins to move, gathering tools, packing furs, preparing for another day. The superstition has served them well, keeping them alive for generations. But beyond that, it is also a story of light conquering darkness, of the first warmth touching the cold, of humanity's fragile defiance against nature's vast indifference. As the sun rises fully, the cave that once glowed orange fades into shadow. The snow beneath their feet glitters like glass. The old man watches the boy disappear into the horizon and whispers to the fire, now dying into embers. For one more day, the world is theirs, until the next frozen dawn, when they must wait again, listening to the silence before the light returns. The world of the caveman was a vast, frozen wilderness, a realm sculpted by wind, ice, and endless time. Mountains groaned under the weight of glaciers that crawled like slow giants across the land, grinding stone into dust and reshaping valleys into deep scars. Rivers, once alive with movement, now slept beneath layers of ice so thick that entire herds could walk across them. The air itself was an enemy, cold, heavy, and merciless. It stripped the skin, burned the lungs, and turned every breath into a reminder that life was fragile. Yet amid this frozen desolation, humans endured, carving existence from the bones of the earth. The last great ice age had wrapped its claws around the planet, pulling temperatures down and forcing life to retreat wherever warmth could still be found. Forests shrank into small patches of hardy pine and birch, while open tundra stretched for miles, covered in snow and frozen grass. The wind howled through the plains, carrying with it the scent of salt from frozen seas and the distant cries of beasts that had adapted to this endless winter. Mammoths, with their shaggy coats and massive tusks, moved in slow, deliberate herds across the horizon. Saber-toothed cats stalked the shadows, their long fangs gleaming like ivory blades. The cavemen lived among giants, and every sunrise was a reminder that they were not rulers of this world, only survivors within it. For most of the year, the land knew no seasons, only degrees of cold. Even summer brought little relief, a brief thaw where rivers gurgled for a few weeks before freezing again. The ground was hard, unyielding, and the wind carved patterns into the snow like the strokes of a cruel painter. To walk across this land was to hear your own heartbeat echo against the silence. To live here was to exist on the knife's edge between endurance and extinction. But humans were adaptable. They had learned to read the sky, to listen to the earth, and to make fire not just for warmth but for survival. They found refuge in caves and rock shelters, choosing places where the wind could not reach and where smoke could escape through cracks in the stone. Their homes were more than hiding places. They were sanctuaries where knowledge, memory, and survival were passed on. Within the walls of those caves, life was preserved through ritual, through storytelling, and through the quiet understanding that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Food was the tribe's greatest concern. The cold killed vegetation, forcing humans to depend on meat, marrow, and fat to keep their bodies from freezing. Every hunt was a desperate gamble. Hunters moved in silence across the snow, tracking footprints and broken branches, reading signs that only instinct could teach. When a kill was made, it was celebrated not as victory, but as reprieve, a small extension of life. Nothing was wasted. Bones were cracked open for marrow, hides were scraped clean and dried for clothing, sinew was used for thread, and fat was stored to feed fires. Each piece of the animal became part of the human story, a fusion of survival, respect, and necessity. The cold shaped not only their bodies, but also their minds. It made them alert, patient, and cautious. In a world where one mistake could end everything, humans became strategists long before they became conquerors. They learned to time their movements with the rhythms of nature, to rest when the cold deepened, to hunt when the sun returned, and to migrate when the land demanded it. Over generations, this instinct became almost spiritual, a silent understanding that the earth was alive and that survival depended on obeying its moods. The nights were the hardest. When the wind rose, it screamed across the plains like a living thing. The stars, bright and countless, glittered above the frozen land, mocking the warmth that no longer existed. Fires crackled weakly in caves and shelters, barely holding back the darkness. People slept in clusters, sharing body heat, dreaming of green lands that might no longer exist. The cold pressed against the walls, whispering through cracks, searching for weakness. Each morning, when the tribe woke, they counted faces, making sure everyone had made it through another night. Yet despite the endless hardship, there was beauty in that world. The light of the sun, when it finally rose, painted the snow in colors that seemed almost unreal, pink, gold, and silver merging together across the frozen plains. Ice crystals sparkled like tiny stars trapped in daylight. The silence was not emptiness, but purity, an ancient stillness that held the heartbeat of the earth. It was in this quiet, this harsh calm, that humans found both their greatest fear and their greatest strength. The cold did not just test them, it forged them. When they moved across the land, they carried everything they owned: tools, furs, weapons, and fire. Each flame was a treasure, guarded carefully, passed from hand to hand, kept alive through wind and storm. To lose fire was to invite death. To protect, it was to protect the future. The tribe understood this better than anything. That life was a balance between what could be controlled and what could not. They could fight hunger, they could build shelters, but they could never fight the cold itself. They could only learn to live beside it. The Ice Age world was vast and unforgiving, but it was also a teacher. It taught humans to cooperate, to share, to endure. Every act of kindness within the tribe, a shared piece of meat, a hand extended toward the weak, was a rebellion against the cruelty of nature. Each sunrise was a small victory, a silent triumph over a universe that seemed determined to erase them. And so, as the snow continued to fall and the glaciers crept forward inch by inch, humanity adapted. They learned to follow herds through frozen valleys, to fish through cracks in the ice, to carve bone into tools and weapons that could pierce the hides of massive beasts. They became masters of fire, of stone, of endurance itself. Their stories began to stretch across generations, passed in whispers beside the flames. They no longer saw themselves as helpless prey, but as part of the same great rhythm: cold and warmth, light and darkness, death and survival. The Ice Age world was not merely a backdrop to their lives. It was their great test, the forge that shaped what humanity would become. Every breath taken in that frozen air carried the same truth, that life, no matter how fragile, finds a way to persist. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the snow each morning, melting frost from stone and skin alike, the tribe was reminded again that they had endured what the earth itself tried to erase. That was their victory. That was the legacy of the Ice Age world. Not conquest, but survival. The moments before sunrise were the most dangerous hours of the day. The darkness that blanketed the frozen world was not just the absence of light. It was alive, watchful, and filled with invisible threats. Every sound was magnified. The crack of ice beneath shifting weight, the distant call of a wolf, the low groan of wind scraping against stone. The tribe knew these sounds too well. They had learned through generations of loss that the darkness before dawn was a place where even the bravest hearts hesitated. No one stepped outside. No one disturbed the untouched snow. It was not cowardice. It was wisdom written in the blood of their ancestors. To understand why they feared the pre-dawn world, one must understand what that world truly was. Before the sun rose, the cold reached its most lethal point. The fire's warmth began to fade, and frost crept across the ground like a living thing, reclaiming what little heat had been won through the night. The air grew still, heavy, and sharp enough to sting the lungs. In that hour, even breath became visible, a ghostly reminder that life was thin and fleeting. And yet, somewhere in that same darkness, predators stirred. Wolves hunted in silence, their eyes glowing faintly with reflected moonlight. The great cave lions moved low across the snow, their paws leaving almost no sound. To venture out before sunrise was to walk into the territory of the unseen. The cavemen, though often called primitive, were masters of awareness. They had no words for temperature, yet they felt its shift in their bones. They had no clocks, yet they could sense the slow pulse of time through the rhythm of wind and shadow. They waited for the first light, not because they worshipped it blindly, but because it was the moment when the world revealed its shape again. In darkness, everything was uncertain. A crack in the ice could seem like solid ground, and a snowdrift could hide a sleeping predator. But when sunlight returned, colors emerged, sounds softened, and the world became knowable once more. The fear of darkness was not irrational. It was built from memory. Long ago, before the tribe had learned to respect the timing of dawn, many had died walking across the night snow. A hunter chasing after a wounded deer vanished into a frozen lake hidden by powder. Another followed the faint glint of eyes in the dark, thinking it prey, and never returned. Over time, the tribe stopped calling these accidents. They began to call them warnings, messages from the cold spirits that lived beneath the snow. Elders said that the spirits walked before the sun, unseen but always listening, marking those who disturbed their rest. When the first light touched the horizon, the spirits vanished, and only then was it safe to walk again. Superstition and survival blurred together until they became one truth. The younger hunters, restless and curious, sometimes questioned the old beliefs. They whispered that maybe there were no spirits at all, only danger and cold. But the old ones shook their heads, reminding them that it didn't matter what name they gave it. Whether they called it spirit, nature, or death itself, the result was the same. Those who stepped on fresh snow before dawn were almost never seen again. The rule kept them alive, and in a world that offered no mercy, that was all that mattered. Inside the caves, they watched the world transform in silence. Before sunrise, light did not come suddenly. It crept slowly, a faint shimmer that made the snow glow blue and silver. The horizon bled with color, but the sun itself remained hidden. This half-light, neither night nor day, was a test of patience. The hunters prepared their tools, checked their spears, and rubbed their hands over the coals, waiting. Every minute stretched longer than the last, and every breath carried the weight of both fear and anticipation. Children, too young to understand danger, sometimes asked why they must wait. Their mothers would whisper that the snow remembers footsteps, that before the sun sees you, even your own shadow can betray you. It was poetry born of survival, an ancient form of teaching through fear. The cold was not only a threat to the body, but a sculptor of belief. It carved stories into human memory, shaping behavior long before there were words to explain it. As dawn approached, the world began to change. The wind slowed. The biting cold eased slightly. The dark line of trees in the distance became visible again. The snow, which had seemed endless and featureless in the night, now revealed its details, ridges, drifts, and the delicate traces of life that had passed through it while the humans slept. Fox prints crisscrossed near the frozen river. A set of massive mammoth tracks curved away into the hills. Even the faint grooves left by dragging branches told stories to those who knew how to read them. The tribe understood these signs better than any written word. To them, snow was language, a map of movement and meaning. But such understanding was only possible after light returned. Before sunrise, the world was a blank page of danger. After sunrise, it became a story they could read. And so, the ritual of waiting was both spiritual and practical. It was patience learned through pain, passed down like sacred law. When the first true ray of sunlight finally broke across the sky, it pierced the darkness like a blade. The snow glittered as though set aflame, and every shadow pulled back into the earth. The people exhaled in unison, shoulders relaxing as the tension of the night dissolved. The hunters rose to their feet, the weight of tradition heavy on their movements. They knew that in this light, they were once again the watchers, not the hunted. The youngest among them still felt the pull of curiosity, the desire to challenge the old ways. But even they hesitated, glancing toward the elders who stood motionless, faces turned toward the sun. There was no spoken prayer, no chant, only silence and understanding. The world before sunrise belonged to the cold and the dark. The world after belonged to the living. And as they stepped out into the light, their feet pressing softly into the snow that no longer hid its secrets, they carried with them the memory of all who had learned the lesson too late. It was not fear that kept them waiting in the dark. It was wisdom, the kind carved by time, by hunger, and by the relentless cold that once ruled everything beneath the shadows before the sun. When the first rays of sunlight finally spilled over the icy horizon, the cavemen knew it was time to begin the hunt. The air, though still painfully cold, shimmered with a pale gold light that stretched across the snowfields. Each breath crystallized instantly, floating away like thin smoke. The tribe's hunters gathered at the mouth of the cave, their silhouettes dark against the glowing snow. They carried spears tipped with sharpened stone, each weapon wrapped tightly in animal sinew to keep it from snapping in the cold. Their bodies were covered in thick furs stitched together from wolf hides and mammoth hair, the only armor between them and the merciless chill. The world beyond the cave was a vast, white silence. Every sound, the crunch of a step, the whistle of wind, felt magnified, echoing endlessly through the frozen valley. The hunters moved carefully, spreading out in a wide formation. They had learned that survival in the cold was not just about strength but silence, not just about speed but patience. One careless sound could scatter prey that had taken days to track. The leader of the hunting party, an older man named Rag, knelt to study the snow. His eyes were sharp and weary, carved with the memory of hundreds of hunts. Before him were the faint impressions of large, round footprints, mammoth tracks. They were old, maybe 2 days, but they told a story. The direction, the spacing, and the depth of each print spoke of small herd, likely moving west toward the forest in search of bark and frozen leaves. Rag's fingers brushed over the prints, feeling the subtle grain of compacted ice beneath. His instincts whispered that the herd wasn't far. He rose without a word, gesturing for the others to follow. The frozen hunt was not a single act of killing. It was a ritual, an endurance of will. In these months, food was life, and every hunt was a question of balance between risk and reward. Mammoths provided everything: meat for the stomach, fat for fire, bones for tools, and hides for shelter. But to take one down required unity, precision, and courage against something 10 times a man's size. The tribe had learned this the hard way. A single misstep during the charge, a spear thrown too soon or too late, could turn the hunter into the hunted. The hunters moved through the valley with quiet grace, scanning the horizon. The ground was uneven, pocked with frozen ridges that crunched underfoot. Snow clung to their lashes and hair, forming thin frost. One of the younger hunters, Drek, spotted something ahead, dark shapes in the distance, moving slowly. His hand tightened on his spear, but Rag raised a hand to stop him. Wait, his eyes seemed to say. The rule of the frozen hunt was simple: never rush. The cold punished haste. They crept closer, taking shelter behind jagged rocks and ice mounds. The shapes grew clearer. 3 mammoths, enormous and ancient, their tusks gleaming pale in the light. Steam rose from their bodies with each breath, a soft mist that glowed against the morning sun. Around them, the snow was churned up from feeding. One of the beasts was limping, its legs slightly bent. That would be their target. The hunters fanned out silently. Each man took his place, rehearsed countless times. They worked not through speech but through understanding, gestures, glances, the rhythm of shared experience. Drek and 2 others circled left, while Rag and the remaining men positioned themselves near the slope ahead, where they could drive the mammoth if it fled. The signal came when Rag lifted his spear high and let it glint once in the sun. A moment later, a sharp whistle cut through the air, startling the herd. The mammoths bellowed, trumpeting in confusion, their breath exploding like clouds. The wounded one stumbled, its movement slowed. Spears flew through the air, cutting arcs of light before burying deep into flesh. The beast roared in pain, swinging its tusks wildly. Snow erupted around it as it charged, its fury shaking the ground. The hunters split instantly, moving with practiced precision. Some drew back to throw again, others darted forward to strike from closer range. One man was nearly crushed as the mammoth turned, but Rag's shout pulled him away in time. Another spear found its mark in the creature's side. The battle raged for long minutes, echoing across the frozen plain with a sound that seemed to blend with the wind. Finally, as the mammoth slowed, its strength drained, Rag advanced. He approached from behind, his breath heavy, his eyes cold and focused. In one smooth motion, he plunged his spear deep beneath the shoulder, striking the heart. The mammoth let out one final cry, low and mournful, before collapsing onto the snow. The world fell silent again. For a long moment, no one moved. The hunters stood still, breathing heavily, surrounded by mist and blood-steamed air. Then, one by one, they raised their weapons high, not in celebration, but in gratitude. They had learned long ago that killing was not triumph. It was survival. Rag placed a hand on the mammoth's hide and murmured a few words in the old tongue, a whisper of respect for the spirit of the fallen beast. Around him, the others bowed their heads. The work that followed was slow and brutal. The cold froze blood almost instantly, making it easier to carve but harder to move. They used flint knives to strip thick slabs of meat, stacking them on hides. Fat was collected separately, precious fuel for lamps and fires. Nothing was wasted. Even the bones were kept for tools and weapons. They worked in silence, each man lost in thought, their breath mingling in the pale air. As they worked, Drek paused to look at the mammoth's eye, still open, clouded by frost. He felt both pride and sorrow. It was his first great hunt, his first step into manhood, but also his first taste of death's weight. The others had long since made peace with it, but for him, the realization was new and heavy. Rag saw his hesitation and spoke softly. Respect it, but do not fear it. Without death, we do not live. By midday, the hunters were ready to return. They lashed the meat onto makeshift sleds and began the long trek back to the caves. The wind had risen again, fierce and unrelenting, sweeping over the plains. Their faces burned with cold, but their hearts were steady. They carried food, warmth, and survival. Behind them, the carcass of the mammoth lay half buried in snow, already claimed by the silence of winter. When they finally reached home, the tribe gathered at the cave entrance. Children ran forward to help, women prepared fires, and elders watched quietly, their eyes glimmering with approval. The hunters had brought life back from the frozen world. The smell of roasting meat soon filled the air, thick and rich. Laughter returned, though softly, never too loud, for they knew the cold was always listening. That night, as flames flickered against stone walls and the wind howled outside, Rag sat alone for a moment, staring into the fire. The light danced in his eyes like a reflection of something ancient. The hunt had been a success, but he knew the balance was fragile. Tomorrow, the cold would still be there, waiting. The ice did not sleep, and the snow never forgot. The frozen hunt was not only a story of survival. It was a pact, a delicate agreement between the living and the dead, between hunger and hope. And as the night deepened, the tribe slept in warmth bought by blood, unaware that beyond the fire's glow, the frozen world was already whispering the next challenge that would come with the dawn. Night returned quickly in the Ice Age. The sun sank beneath the horizon, leaving the land swallowed once again by endless white darkness. Inside the cave, the fire was life itself. Its crackling glow painted the walls in gold and orange, chasing shadows that seemed to crawl back from the edges of the dark. The tribe gathered around it in silence. Hunters, mothers, elders, children, all facing the flames as if before God. Fire was not just warmth. It was safety, memory, and hope. Without it, the cold would claim everything. The firekeepers sat closest to the flames. They were not warriors, nor the strongest in the tribe, but their duty was sacred. It was said that in the ancient times, before men had learned to speak, the first gift given by the sky was fire, stolen from lightning that struck a tree and captured in trembling hands. Since then, no tribe allowed it to die. The fire must always live, pass from one night to the next like a heartbeat that could never stop. Tonight, the duty belonged to two women. Ina, the elder with silver hair and eyes clouded by smoke, and her apprentice, Mira, barely in her teens. Ina's hands moved slowly as she fed small branches in the fire, careful not to let the flame choke or grow wild. "Too much wood and it will suffocate," she murmured. "Too little, and it will starve." Mira nodded, her face glowing with reflected light. Every spark that rose into the air seemed alive, each one carrying a story, a memory, or a warning. Around them, the others rested. The hunters slept near the entrance, weapons within reach. The mothers wrapped children in furs, whispering quiet songs that echoed softly against the stone walls. The old man, Rag, sat apart, sharpening a spear tip by the flicker of firelight. His expression was distant, lost in thought. He knew that tomorrow they must move again. The herd would not return to the valley for many days, and the ice was creeping closer each night. Outside, the wind moaned like a voice from another world. It pressed against the cave, searching for a way in. Sometimes it carried strange sounds, the cry of wolves, the distant crack of ice breaking far across the frozen plain. But inside, the fire's hum drowned them all. Aina leaned closer to Mira. "Listen to it," she said softly. "The fire speaks. It tells us when it's hungry, when it's angry, when it's afraid. Never turn your back on it." Mira stared into the flames. She thought she saw faces forming in the smoke, spirits of the ancestors, watching, whispering in the crackle. Her heart beat faster. "Does it remember them?" she asked. Aina smiled faintly. "It remembers everything. Every winter, every hunt, every death. Fire never forgets. It is the same fire that warmed our first mothers." When the tribe slept, the firekeepers stayed awake. It was a lonely task, keeping the flame alive while the world outside froze. Myra's eyelids grew heavy, but Aina tapped her arm gently. "Stay awake," she said. "If it dies, we die." Mira nodded again and forced her eyes open. She reached for another branch, feeding it into the glowing heart of the fire. Sparks leapt up, dancing toward the cave ceiling like stars escaping into the night. Hours passed. Aina spoke in stories, the kind only told to those who tended the flame. She spoke of the time before warmth, when men huddled in darkness, their skin cracking from cold, their bones brittle and hollow. She told of the first hunter who dared to carry a burning branch across the snow, protecting it from wind and fear until he reached his people. He was the first firekeeper, Aina said, and he was the first to live through winter. Mira listened, imagining the man walking through storms, holding fire in his hands as if carrying the sun itself. She could almost feel his heartbeat in the rhythm of the crackling logs. She wondered if someday she, too, would be remembered, if someone would tell her story to another child sitting beside another fire. Suddenly, the wind outside shifted. It grew louder, more violent. The flames wavered, bowing under the force of the cold air seeping through the cracks in the stone. Mira gasped and reached for more wood, but Aina held up a hand. "No," she said firmly. "Wait." She watched the fire's movement, the way it flickered blue, then yellow, then steadied again. "Now," Aina whispered. Together, they fed the logs in carefully measured rhythm. The flames swelled, roared, and pushed back the cold once more. In the darkness beyond the cave, faint eyes watched. Wolves, their bodies half hidden behind drifts of snow. They could smell the meat and the warmth, the living pulse of the fire that their instincts feared but envied. They prowled closer, their breath steaming in the cold. But when the flames flared brighter, they stopped, tails low, and slunk back into the night. Fire protected its own. As the storm howled, the firekeepers worked silently. Aina's face was calm, her eyes reflecting the same flame she had watched for 50 winters. Myra's hands trembled with exhaustion, but she refused to let the fire dim. Around them, the rest of the tribe slept undisturbed, wrapped in the comfort of warmth they did not see maintained. It was always this way. Some bore the cold so others could dream. By the time dawn's first light touched the snow outside, the fire had burned steadily through the night. Aina finally leaned back, exhaling softly. "You did well," she told Mira. "The flame will live another day." Mira smiled faintly, her eyes heavy but proud. The glow from the fire painted her face with a quiet strength. Rag stirred at the edge of the cave, rising slowly. His shadow fell across the firekeepers. He nodded in silent acknowledgement. The tribe would eat today, move today, live today, all because the fire had survived the night. As the others began to wake, Aina looked toward the cave's mouth, where the pale light of morning spread across the snow. She whispered an old prayer to the flame, a thank you, a promise, a plea. Mira watched her, understanding now why the task was sacred. It was not just about warmth or light. It was about defiance, a living answer to the cold that ruled the world outside. For in the Ice Age, fire was not merely a tool. It was the soul of mankind, a fragile, flickering heartbeat in a world made of ice. And those who kept it burning were not just guardians of heat. They were keepers of life itself. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the land. Outside, snow lay heavy and sculpted by the wind into smooth white dunes, burying tracks, traps, and even small animals beneath its weight. The tribe emerged from their cave slowly, blinking against the sharp glare of the sun bouncing off the endless whiteness. Every breath came in shallow clouds. The world seemed silent again, but it was a silence that held danger beneath its beauty. The cold was a patient hunter, unseen, unhurried, always waiting. Their cave, once a place of safety, was growing too small. The fire's smoke collected thickly in the air, and the icy wind crept in through every crack in the stone. It would not protect them much longer. Rag knew this. He stood on the ridge, staring out across the frozen valley. His breath was steady, his eyes narrowed against the wind. He was searching, not for animals, but for shelter, a place where his people could outlast the next wave of cold. They had learned over countless winters that caves were not always enough. Sometimes the ice itself became their home. They built shelters from snow and bone, from hide and ash, fragile but miraculous constructions that defied the deathly wind. Rag called the strongest hunters to him, and pointed toward the plains below. "We build," he said simply. They nodded, understanding the command without need for more words. The chosen site was beside a cluster of boulders, where the wind slowed and the snow gathered deep. The tribe began their work with slow, deliberate movements. First, they cleared a space, scraping away loose snow to reach the firmer layers beneath. Then they drove mammoth bones into the ground, long ribs and curved tusks, relics of hunts past, to form the skeleton of their new home. The bones creaked faintly under pressure, but they were strong. Over them, the hunters laid thick hides stitched from reindeer skin and wolf pelts, layering them until the wind could no longer cut through. The women worked beside the men, their hands red from the cold. They packed snow between the layers of hide to seal gaps, shaping it with stone scrapers until the structure resembled a dome, half cave, half beast. Smoke holes were carved at the top to release the breath of fire. It was hard, aching work. Fingers went numb, breath froze on skin, but no one stopped. Each movement carried purpose. To stop was to freeze. To build was to live. Inside, the shelter was dark and tight, but warmer. The hides trapped body heat, and once a small fire was lit at the center, the air began to soften. Rag ducked inside and ran his hand along the curved wall. The faint warmth beneath his palm was proof of survival, proof that humanity could still carve comfort from cruelty. He looked around at the faces of his people, their cheeks flushed red from cold, their eyes wide with exhaustion but glinting with pride. "The ice takes," he said quietly, "but it also gives. We live because we learn." As night fell again, the wind rose outside, howling across the plains like a chorus of ancient spirits. But within the bone shelter, the world was still. The fire flickered low, shadows dancing over the white walls. The sound of breathing replaced the sound of the storm. Children huddled together under furs, tracing their fingers over the smooth curves of mammoth bones. Mira, the young firekeeper, whispered stories of the ancestors, how they once built homes from nothing but snow and courage. The children listened with wide eyes, comforted by the rhythm of her voice. Outside, the snow pressed heavier against the walls, muffling the world into silence. The bone frames groaned softly, but they held. It was as if the spirits of the creatures they came from now guarded the tribe, forming a circle of strength around the fragile flicker of life within. Aina, the elder woman, believed this deeply. She sat cross-legged near the fire, eyes closed, murmuring prayers in the old tongue. Her words were slow and rhythmic, meant to call upon the spirits of the mammoths and wolves whose remains now sheltered them. Rag sat nearby, sharpening his blade. His thoughts wandered, not toward hunger or tomorrow's hunt, but toward time itself. How many winters had they survived like this? How many generations had learned the same lessons, made the same shelters, whispered the same stories in the glow of firelight? He wondered if the world beyond the ice would ever change, if one day the snow would melt and the land would breathe green again. But for now, the cold ruled, and they obeyed its laws. Each person in the tribe had a role. The hunters hunted, the women mended hides, the elders taught, and the firekeepers watched. Their unity was their warmth. Their labor was their prayer. In the heart of the storm, their shelter became more than a structure. It was a symbol of defiance, of the fragile strength that kept humanity alive through centuries of unending winter. In the small hours before dawn, when the fire dimmed and most had fallen asleep, Mira stirred. She crawled to the entrance and lifted the hide flap slightly. The air that rushed in was sharp as knives. Beyond the opening, she could see the frozen plain glowing under the light of a full moon. Everything sparkled, vast and pure. She shivered, both from the cold and the beauty. Behind her, Aina's voice drifted softly. "Close it, child. The cold listens when we dream." Mira obeyed, lowering the flap. The wind sighed against it like a sigh of disappointment. As she lay back down beside the fire, she watched the shadows flicker across the bone walls. The shapes seemed to move, mammoths walking across the ice, hunters with spears, the endless cycle of life and death replayed in light. She understood then what Aina meant when she said the fire remembered. These shelters, these flames, these people, they were all pieces of the same story, carried forward one breath, one winter, one heartbeat at a time. Outside, the storm raged, tearing at the snow and bending the ice. But inside the shelter of bones, the tribe slept in peace. Their fire burned low but steady, its glow pulsing gently against the pale walls. The world might have been frozen, endless, and merciless, but within that fragile dome of warmth, something eternal endured, the quiet, unyielding will to live. As the days passed beneath the endless winter sky, a strange stillness settled over the valley. The fire still burned, the bone shelters still stood, but food was growing scarce. The last of the mammoth meat had been dried and stored, and the hunters' traps came back empty more often than full. Even the scavenger birds had disappeared, their cries replaced by the distant groan of shifting ice. It was the season the elders called the hunger moon, the cruelest time of all, when even the strongest began to tremble and the weak grew silent. The cold was no longer just outside. It crept into the body, gnawing from within, turning muscle to stone and thought to fog. Rag watched his people with heavy eyes. Every face was thinner now, every step slower. Even the children had stopped playing, conserving energy like small animals in burrows. He knew that this was the true test of winter, not the storms or the predators, but the waiting. The slow, invisible war between the will to live and the urge to surrender. At dawn, when the sun rose pale and weak over the snowfields, Rag gathered his hunters. Their fur cloaks hung loosely on their frames, and their breath came in shallow puffs. They stood silently, understanding what was required. Somewhere beyond the frozen ridges, there might still be life, a herd that had not yet moved south, or the tracks of wolves feasting on carrion. They would go, though each step cost them more than they could afford. Before leaving, they shared a small ritual, a single piece of dried meat, passed hand to hand, touched to each lip before being placed on the fire. It was an offering, a reminder to the spirits that the tribe still remembered their old promises. Aina murmured a chant, her voice cracked and hoarse. "Take this hunger from our hearts, but not our courage," she whispered. The flames consumed the offering with a hiss, and the hunters turned toward the horizon. The snow that day was blinding, reflecting the weak sunlight like shards of broken glass. The wind had sharpened again, cutting at their eyes and faces. Each man moved with slow precision, testing the ground before every step. They followed a narrow path along the frozen river, where cracks glowed faintly blue beneath the ice. Drek, the youngest hunter, paused often to listen. The silence pressed on his ears until it felt almost like a sound of its own, heavy, endless, humming. Hours passed with no sign of life. The hunters' shadows stretched long across the snow. Then at last, Rag spotted movement, faint, distant, but real. A small herd of deer, their thin bodies grazing desperately at the edge of a wind-blown slope. Hope surged briefly through the group, but Rag raised his hand. The wind direction was wrong. If they approached too soon, the deer would catch their scent and vanish into the white. They crouched low, waiting, every second an agony of cold. Drek's fingers were numb. He tried to grip his spear tighter, but it slipped slightly in his hand. He thought of the fire back in the shelter, of Mira and the others waiting, of the smell of meat that once filled the cave. Hunger gnawed at him like a living thing. Then, with a breathless nod from Rag, the hunters moved. They spread out silently, circling the herd like ghosts in the snow. The first spear flew true. It struck the lead deer through the ribs. The herd scattered in panic, snow exploding beneath their hooves. The hunters gave chase, their movements clumsy but desperate. Two more spears found their mark before the rest vanished into the blizzard. Drek lunged forward and drove his weapon into the struggling deer's throat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The animal's blood steamed as it hit the snow. The smell was metallic, raw, intoxicating. For a moment, no one spoke. They simply stared at the fallen creatures, at life returned, however briefly, to their starving hands. Rag broke the silence with a low voice. We thank them. Each hunter placed a hand on the bodies in turn, whispering words of gratitude. There was no celebration, only solemn relief. The cold would not take them today. They butchered the meat quickly, wrapping pieces in hide and tying them to their backs. The blood that stained their hands froze almost instantly. The walk back was longer than the journey out. Every gust of wind seemed heavier, more punishing. Twice they had to stop and rest, their strength nearly gone. Drek stumbled once, falling to his knees. Rag pulled him up wordlessly. The boy's face was pale and hollow, but his eyes still burned with stubborn light. By the time they reached the shelter, darkness had fallen. The smell of fire met them before the sight of it, smoke curling up through the cold like a promise kept. The others rushed out to meet them, eyes wide, voices trembling with relief. Aina wept openly as she saw the meat. Mira helped carry it inside, her hands shaking as she placed it near the fire. The flames hissed as the fat dripped into them, sending up sparks that danced like stars. That night they ate in silence. The meat was tough and lean, but to them, it tasted like life itself. Each bite felt sacred. The fire glowed brighter than it had in days, and the warmth seemed to seep deeper into their bones. For the first time in many nights, laughter returned, soft, hesitant, but real. Children smiled again. Even the elders' eyes gleamed with something close to joy. Later, when most had fallen asleep, Rag sat awake, staring into the dying embers. He thought about the herd, about the price of survival. For every life they took, they owed another to the earth. That balance, fragile, eternal, was what kept the world from falling apart. He closed his eyes and whispered a silent vow that his people would never forget the cost of warmth. Outside, the moon hung low over the snow, pale and distant. The hunger moon, they called it, the season of testing when the cold stripped away everything except what truly mattered. But within the bone shelter, the tribe endured. They had fire, they had food, and for one more night, against the endless winter, they had won. In the heart of that merciless winter, the fire became more than warmth. It became belief. When all else failed, when the sun itself seemed too weak to rise, the tribe turned inward toward the flame. Every flicker of orange light was a heartbeat of the world, every spark a whisper from something ancient and unseen. Rag understood this better than most. He had seen what hunger and cold could do to the mind, how easily despair crept in when the dark pressed too close. The fire, he told himself, was their only god now, one they could feed, protect, and understand. Each morning began with ritual. Before the first light of dawn, Aina would crouch near the ashes, hands trembling as she breathed life back into the coals. Her hair hung in tangled black strands, her lips whispering old words learned from elders long gone. The others watched in silence. When the fire finally sparked, a low murmur rippled through the group, a mixture of relief and reverence. It was not mere habit. It was survival through faith. The flame meant another day. They had learned to measure time not by the sun, but by the fire's rhythm, the feeding of wood, the gathering of smoke, the fading to embers. Rag organized shifts so the fire would never die. 2 guards remained awake at all times, feeding twigs, dry bones, and even bits of hide when wood ran out. The forest, once abundant, had become a frozen maze of lifeless trees, their cores turned to stone by frost. Still, the hunters ventured out each day to gather what they could, dragging back splintered branches or the remains of fallen trees. At night, the shelter pulsed with light. The shadows danced on the walls, forming shapes that seemed alive. Children stared into them, half afraid, half enchanted. Aina told stories of the first fire, how lightning struck a tree, and the flames that followed gave birth to humanity. Fire remembers us, she would say softly. It knows our breath, our hands, our hunger. That is why it listens. Her words brought comfort to the weak and meaning to the suffering. The people clung to them like warmth itself, but not everyone believed. Drek, restless and young, often questioned the old ways. Fire is just fire, he whispered one night when Rag sat beside him. It burns what we feed it. It doesn't listen. It doesn't care. His voice was bitter, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Rag looked at him for a long moment before answering. Maybe, he said quietly, but believing it does care keeps us alive. The boy didn't reply. He stared into the flame until it blurred and wavered like a ghost. That night, the wind howled harder than before. Snow slipped through cracks in the bone walls, swirling across the floor. The fire sputtered, gasping under the cold's assault. Aina cried out and threw more fuel onto it, bones, hides, even a carved totem that had once hung by the entrance. The flames rose again, snapping angrily as if offended by the challenge. The tribe huddled close, eyes wide, feeling the cold breath just inches away. By morning, the storm had passed, but the shelter bore scars. Walls warped, food stores buried in snow. Still, the fire had lived. Aina declared a sign. The spirit chose us, she said. We gave it everything, and it stayed. Some nodded, others simply bowed their heads in gratitude. For Rag, the message was simpler. Survival required faith because faith created purpose. Without it, the will to keep fighting would fade faster than any flame. Days blurred into one another. Outside, the world was endless white. Inside, the rhythm of the tribe pulsed like the beating of a heart. Eat, rest, tend the fire, sleep. Sometimes, when silence grew too heavy, Aina led chants. The deep hum of voices filled the shelter, echoing off the bones, vibrating in the air like something alive. It warmed them in ways no flame could. Then, one night, something strange happened. As Rag added wood to the fire, he noticed a pattern in the smoke, a twisting shape rising like a figure. For a brief instant, it looked almost human, arms outstretched, head tilted as though watching them. The others saw it too. A murmur spread through the room, half fear, half awe. Aina fell to her knees, whispering blessings. The fire speaks, she said. It shows itself to guide us. Rag wanted to dismiss it as imagination, a trick of light and fatigue. But deep inside, he felt something stir, a shiver not of cold, but of recognition. Maybe it didn't matter whether the fire truly spoke. What mattered was that it gave them hope when the world had none. Hope could not be hunted or stored, yet it kept them alive longer than food ever could. In the following days, Aina's rituals grew more elaborate. She painted red symbols near the hearth using berry juice and ash. The marks looked like flames themselves, curling, reaching, devouring. Each morning, she asked the fire for strength, and each night she thanked it for mercy. The people followed her example. Even Drek, though skeptical, began to whisper a few words before sleeping. The hunger was still there, but so was something else now. Unity. As the moon waned and the winds shifted, small signs of change appeared. The air felt slightly softer, the daylight lasting a breath longer each day. Rag sensed that the hardest days might soon pass. But he also knew that without faith, in fire, in each other, they would not have made it this far. The fire had become the center of their existence, their memory, their connection to life itself. One evening, as the tribe gathered around the flames, Rag stood and spoke. When the world turns warm again, he said, we will still keep the fire burning. Not because we need it, but because it remembers what we survived. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with quiet conviction. Aina nodded, tears shining in her eyes. The others bowed their heads, feeling the truth in his words. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of melting, the first whisper of spring hidden beneath the snow. Inside, the fire glowed steady and strong, no longer a desperate flame, but a sacred promise. In its light, the tribe saw not just survival, but the reason they endured. Fire had become their faith, and faith their fire. The cold had stripped the land of mercy. Snow stretched endlessly across the plains, a white wasteland where even shadows seemed frozen. For the tribe, every day became a negotiation between hunger and frostbite, between the will to hunt and the fear of what waited in the frozen silence. Rag knew that if they didn't bring back meat soon, the fire they worshipped would burn for nothing but ghosts. The caches of dried roots and marrow bones were nearly gone, and the children had begun to cry through the night with empty bellies. The time for risk had come again. Before dawn, a hunting party gathered, 6 figures wrapped in animal hides, their breath fogging in the air like smoke. Rag led them, carrying his sharpened spear tipped with flint and bone. Beside him walked Drek, his young eyes hard with determination. The others, Lura, Kron, Moth, and Old Jor, followed silently, their steps crunching on the ice. They moved like shadows, their bodies hunched low, the cold slicing through every layer of fur. No one spoke. Words could carry through the still air and alert predators or prey alike. Their destination was the frozen valley where they had once seen mammoths migrating before the deep freeze. Now, the great beasts were fewer, scattered, and desperate, but where there were mammoths, there was life and warmth in their massive hides. The tribe's future depended on it. They followed the faint tracks half buried in snow, each footprint like a promise leading them deeper into the heart of winter. Hours passed. The sun rose weak and pale, offering no comfort. The wind howled through the valleys, dragging fine crystals of snow into their eyes. Moth stopped suddenly, raising his hand. In the distance, movement, a dark shape shifting against the white horizon. They crouched low. Rag squinted and saw them. 3 mammoths, slow and tired, moving through the snow like ghosts of another world. A mother and her young, guarded by a scarred old bull. The hunters knew what this meant. Attacking a mammoth was never safe, but starvation made the decision for them. Rag's mind raced. The bull had to be separated. They could use fire, a trick learned from desperation and cleverness. Lura pulled out a small bundle of dried moss and resin wrapped in hide. With flint and stone, she sparked it to life, creating a small, smoldering torch. The smell of smoke drifted across the snow. Slowly, the wind carried it toward the mammoths. The great beasts lifted their heads, their breath steaming. The calf trumpeted, frightened. Rag signaled silently. The hunters spread out, forming a crescent. They advanced, driving the smoke closer. The bull bellowed, stamping its massive feet. Then suddenly chaos. The mammoths turned, panic spreading through them like fire through dry grass. The young ones slipped, crashing into the snow. Rag saw his moment. Now, he shouted. Spears flew. One struck deep into the calf's flank, another into its shoulder. The air filled with the sound of pain, a deep, terrible roar that shook the ground. The mother charged, her tusks slicing through the air. Moth barely rolled aside before being crushed. Jor stumbled, falling backward into the snow as the massive shadow loomed over him. Rag roared, driving his spear into the mammoth's side again and again. Blood, steaming and red against the white snow, sprayed across his hands. The mother staggered, trumpeted one last time, and fell. Silence returned, heavy and trembling. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Drek laughed, a wild sound of triumph. Meat, he said, breathless. Fire and meat. The others joined him, their voices shaking with relief. Rag stood over the fallen creature, his chest rising and falling. He whispered a quiet thanks, not to gods, but to the spirit of survival itself. They had risked everything, and the world had spared them once more. It took hours to butcher the mammoth, the air filled with the smell of blood and steam. They carved the thick meat into slabs, wrapping it in hides to carry back. The hide itself would serve as blankets, tents, even fuel when dry. Every piece of the creature had a purpose. Nothing could be wasted. They worked in grim silence, aware that the scent of blood might draw predators. And indeed, as the light began to fade, the howls came, distant at first, then closer. Wolves. Moo! Rag barked. They loaded what they could and began the long trek back through the snow. The wolves followed, their glowing eyes flickering in the distance like embers. The hunters quickened their pace, breath ragged, limbs heavy. The fire in their village felt a lifetime away. Lura stumbled once, and Drek grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. Behind them, a wolf darted close, too close. Kron hurled his spear, striking it mid-leap. The animal fell, twisting in the snow. The rest hesitated, then vanished back into the night. When the hunters finally saw the glow of their campfire, exhaustion turned to euphoria. The tribe rushed to meet them, their eyes wide at the sight of meat. Aina wept openly, clutching Raga's arm. "The fire answered," she whispered. "It sent you strength." Rag didn't argue. In a frozen world of the Ice Age, man was not the only hunter. He lived surrounded by giants, beasts of power and instinct, creatures that ruled the land long before humans dared to step upon it. To survive among them required not only courage, but respect. Every day was a contest of awareness, a constant dance between predator and prey. The cavemen were not at the top of this chain. They were intruders in a world of titans, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, cave lions, and bears the size of nightmares. These animals were both teachers and threats, shaping human behavior, tools, and even their myths. For the cavemen, to know the beast was to understand the rules of life itself. The wilderness around them pulsed with danger. Tracks in the snow told silent stories of the night. The heavy prints of a bear, the deep claw marks of a cat dragging its kill, the long lines where wolves had run in packs. To ignore these signs was to die. Cavemen became masters of observation, learning to read the land like a language. The broken branches, the direction of fur in the wind, the smell of blood, all were clues. They studied the habits of the predators, knowing when they hunted, where they slept, and which sounds meant they were near. This knowledge did not make them safe, but it gave them a chance, and a chance was enough. Sometimes, they hunted the same prey as the beasts. Mammoths, bison, and reindeer drew both man and predator to the same fields. There were moments when hunts turned to chaos, when wolves burst from the brush or lions charged from the shadows. In those moments, survival became pure instinct, a blur of running feet, flying spears, and shouts torn from the throat. Many did not survive, but those who did carried new wisdom written in scars. They learned that power alone was not enough. Cunning, timing, and unity mattered more than brute strength. But not every encounter was war. In their long observation of animals, cavemen began to mimic them, to study their ways, to borrow their instincts. They learned how wolves tracked prey, how bears found shelter, how birds sensed storms before they came. Nature became their silent teacher. They moved more quietly, hunted more effectively, and began to understand the balance of the wild. This respect for the beasts changed them. It gave birth to the first seeds of empathy. They saw not just enemies, but fellow survivors in the same cruel world. And yet, fear never left them. The nights echoed with the howls of predators, and the shadows beyond the firelight were alive with movement. Every roar in the dark reminded the cavemen of their fragility. The fire became their fortress, its glow keeping the unknown at bay. Stories told by the elders turned predators into spirits, creatures of both terror and reverence. The cave lion became the guardian of the hunt, the wolf the symbol of loyalty and cunning, the bear a spirit of strength and endurance. Through myth, they gave meaning to fear, transforming it into reverence. These beliefs would echo across millennia, shaping the way humanity saw the natural world forever. Some tribes even learned to follow the predators, not in worship, but in wisdom. They tracked wolf packs to find herds of animals or scavenge kills left behind by lions. They understood that to live among these creatures was to adapt to them, to read their rhythm rather than resist it. Slowly, the line between fear and understanding began to blur. Man was no longer just prey. He was becoming a rival, a strategist. The relationship between human and beast was also reflected in their art. On the walls of caves deep beneath the earth, cavemen painted the animals they feared and depended on. Mammoths, lions, bison, and horses, etched in ochre and charcoal, came to life by firelight, their shapes moving as if alive. These paintings were more than decoration. They were prayers, expressions of connection. The people believed that to draw the animal was to honor its spirit, to ensure success in the next hunt, to balance life and death. Each brush of pigment was a whisper to the wild. We see you, we respect you. Over time, this coexistence shaped the path of evolution itself. Humans developed sharper senses, quicker minds, and deeper emotional intelligence from living in constant awareness. Fear became a tool. It sharpened their instincts, made them cautious, inventive, alive. Through generations of struggle, they learned that survival was not about conquering nature, but understanding it. In the eyes of the predator, they saw their own reflection, hungry, desperate, unyielding. In the end, it was this understanding that elevated humanity. The beasts taught them how to listen to the land, how to adapt to change, and how to move with the rhythm of life instead of against it. While many of those mighty creatures would one day vanish with the ice, their lessons remained carved in human memory. And so, under the pale sky and the cold wind, the cavemen walked the same trails as the predators, their paths intertwined in a story older than fire. They were not masters of the wild, not yet, but they had learned to belong to it. Among the roars, the tracks, and the shadows, humanity found its place. It was here, in the company of beasts, that man began to understand what it truly meant to live. The world above had gone quiet, too quiet. The wind no longer screamed across the valley, and the storms had withdrawn into some far horizon, leaving behind a strange stillness. But inside the ice shelter, that silence carried its own kind of weight. Without the roar of the blizzard or the crash of branches, every sound seemed amplified. Every crack of the fire, every sigh, every heartbeat. The tribe lived in a cocoon of quiet that both protected and haunted them. Rag could feel it pressing down, heavy as the ice above their heads. Days lost their shape. Without the sun to mark time, the line between morning and night blurred. The fire was their only measure, fed, tended, dimmed, and rekindled again. Aina began scratching tallies into the frozen wall, counting each cycle of the flame as a day, but even she lost track after a while. The silence numbed more than their ears. It numbed their sense of the world beyond. The children whispered less, laughter faded, and the tribe's movements became slow and automatic. They ate, they rested, they stared into the flames, waiting for something they could no longer name. Rag noticed the change first in Drek. The young hunter had become restless, pacing the tunnels at night. "It's too quiet," he muttered. "It feels like we're the only ones left." His eyes flicked toward the ice walls as though expecting them to speak. Rag understood the unease. The silence carried strange illusions. Sometimes footsteps echoed where none were made, or voices murmured just beyond the torchlight. Aina said it was the ice remembering all who had died before them, whispering their names in dreams. The elders believed her. The younger ones tried not to. But fear, once named, found its way into everyone's mind. One evening, as they sat around the fire, old Jor began telling a story. His voice was gravelly, but it broke the silence like a gift. He spoke of the first long night, the time before memory, when the sky froze and humans hid beneath the world. "The sun left us," he said, his hands tracing slow shapes in the air. "And we waited, just as we do now, but some never saw the light again. They became shadows, the ones who wander between worlds." Aina crossed herself in the old way, and the children pulled closer to the fire. Rag listened, not because he believed, but because the story itself felt alive. It gave shape to their fear, and that made it easier to bear. That night, as the fire burned low, Rag awoke to a sound, soft, rhythmic like breathing, but not human. He rose quietly and followed the noise through the tunnel. It came from the deeper chamber, where no one slept. His torch flickered against the blue walls, revealing frost glinting like tiny stars. The sound stopped. He waited, listening, but there was only silence again, deep, hollow, endless. When he returned to the main room, Aina was awake. Her eyes followed him, calm but knowing. "The ice moves," she said simply. "It remembers we are here." He said nothing, but the unease stayed with him for days. The silence began to change them. Words felt heavy, as though speaking too loudly might break something sacred. Even the children moved softly, learning to live like ghosts. They hunted less, partly because food was still plentiful, but mostly because no one wanted to leave the safety of their frozen refuge. Yet safety had its own dangers. Without sound, without movement, the mind turned inward. Thoughts grew dark. Krom began muttering in his sleep, calling names no one recognized. Lura claimed she saw shapes moving behind the firelight. Aina tried to soothe them, weaving herbs into smoke and whispering prayers. "The night tests us," she said. "It wants to see who still believes in the dawn." Rag struggled to hold the tribe together. He forced them to keep routines, sharpening tools, repairing hides, melting snow for water, anything to keep hands busy and minds awake. But still, he felt the weight of the silence gnawing at his own resolve. Sometimes he caught himself staring into the fire for hours, his thoughts lost in the flickering glow. The line between dream and waking blurred. One evening, Drek approached him. "We need to go out," he said quietly, "even just for a while. The air in here feels wrong." Rag hesitated but agreed. They gathered their furs and climbed through the narrow entrance tunnel. The world outside was blinding. The snow gleamed under the faint light of a thin moon. No wind, no sound, just endless stillness. The river lay motionless, sealed in glass. The stars above looked close enough to touch. They stood there for a long moment, breathing the open air. It was colder, sharper, but it felt alive. Drek smiled faintly. "I thought the world had stopped," he whispered. "But it's still here." Rag nodded. The silence outside felt different. Not oppressive, but waiting. It was the kind of stillness that came before change. When they returned to the cave, something had shifted inside them. The silence no longer frightened them as much. It was still there, vast and ancient, but they had touched the sky again, even for a moment. They shared this feeling with the others, telling them of the stars and the frozen light of the moon. Slowly, hope began to stir once more. Aina said the silence was not a curse, but a message. The world was holding its breath before it exhaled life again. The next day, the ice cracked faintly above their heads, not in threat, but in promise. Drops of water began to fall again, slow and steady, like the ticking of time restarting. The long night was ending, though none of them could yet see the sun. As they sat together that evening, Rag looked around the shelter. The fire's glow shimmered across faces lined with weariness and will. The silence remained, but now it felt different. No longer an enemy, but a companion. They had lived through the stillness, through the endless dark, and found something within it. Patience. Outside, the wind whispered for the first time in many weeks. A faint sigh moving through the valley. It was not loud, but it was enough. The world had begun to wake again. Rag closed his eyes and smiled. The silence had taught them one final lesson, that survival was not always noise and struggle. Sometimes it was simply waiting without breaking, holding your breath until the light returns. The first sign was small, so small that none of them noticed it at first. A faint drip, like a heartbeat hidden beneath the walls. Then another, and another. Soon, the rhythm grew steady, echoing softly through the tunnels of ice. It was water, real, moving water, slipping down from the ceiling in thin, shining threads. For weeks, they had heard nothing but the sound of their own breathing, the crackle of fire, the shifting of frozen stone. Now, the cave itself seemed to breathe again. Aina was the first to understand. She lifted her head and whispered, "The earth is waking." Rag ran his hands along the icy wall and felt it, damp and slick, alive again. The frozen walls that had once sealed them and were softening at their edges. The air felt different too. Not much warmer, but less biting. The smoke from the fire curled upward more easily, and the cold no longer clung as fiercely to their skin. The silence that had haunted them began to fade, replaced by faint groans of melting ice and the distant whisper of trickling water. For the tribe, it was both a relief and a warning. The thaw meant life returning, but it also meant danger. If the ice walls melted too quickly, their shelter could collapse. Rag ordered the hunters to check the entrance tunnel each morning. They cleared pathways where the meltwater gathered, carving small channels to guide it away from their fire. It became a daily ritual. The sound of scraping tools and dripping water filled the cavern, blending into a strange, hopeful music. The children were the first to laugh again. They played near the water channels, flicking droplets at each other, their giggles echoing down the icy halls. For the first time in many moons, the sound of joy returned. Aina smiled as she watched them, her eyes glistening. "When children laugh," she said softly, "the world cannot stay frozen for long." The others nodded, hearts lighter than they had been in months. But with warmth came movement, and with movement came uncertainty. Strange cracks began appearing along the upper walls of the chamber. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, a deep rumble would roll through the cave like distant thunder. The ground trembled faintly, reminding them that the same earth giving them life could also take it away. One morning, a section of the tunnel roof collapsed, sealing off one of the side chambers. No one was hurt, but it sent a chill through the camp. Rag knew the thaw was not just a gift. It was a test. They began to prepare for the world outside. Their furs were patched and dried, weapons resharpened, and sleds repaired. The snow that had once buried everything might soon soften enough to travel across. Drek, restless as ever, pressed Rag to lead an early scouting party. "We can find the old hunting grounds," he said, eyes burning with impatience. "Maybe the herds have started to move again." Aina warned against haste. "The thaw begins with trickles," she reminded them. "Let the earth breathe before you walk upon it." Rag decided to wait. "A few more days," he said, until the water ran freely and the light grew stronger. Those days were filled with tension and quiet wonder. The tribe gathered near the entrance tunnel often, peering out at the pale, changing world. The sky was still gray, but the air shimmered with faint hints of warmth. The snow no longer looked dead and hard. It glistened, alive with reflection. Small rivulets ran down the slopes, carving paths through the white. And in one miraculous moment, Aina spotted a patch of green, a sprig of moss pushing through the melting ice. She fell to her knees and touched it, weeping softly. "Life remembers," she whispered. Inside, the air grew humid, and their once clear ice walls turned cloudy. The smell of melting earth began to seep in, the rich, ancient scent of soil long hidden beneath the frost. For some, it was intoxicating. For others, unsettling. "It smells like ghosts," muttered Kron, wrinkling his nose. But Rag smiled. "It smells like the beginning," he said. One night, as the fire burned low, they heard a sound none of them had expected, a distant call echoing faintly through the tunnel. The first light of true dawn spilled over the frozen horizon like liquid fire, melting the shadows that had haunted them for so long. Rag stood at the mouth of the cave, his breath rising in pale ribbons. The thaw had revealed what they had all been waiting for, tracks, deep and deliberate, winding across the valley floor. They were not human. They belonged to something ancient, something massive. A herd. The mammoths had returned. For the first time in months, Rag's chest swelled with something close to joy. The world was moving again, and that meant hope and food. The news spread quickly through the tribe, igniting a pulse of energy that had been dormant through the endless winter. The hunters gathered their tools, testing each spear, binding each point with fresh sinew. The young ones, restless with excitement, begged to join the hunt, but Rag's expression stayed stern. "Only those who have faced the cold outside will face the beast," he said. Drek grinned at his side, gripping his sharpened spear. "Then we hunt as brothers again," he said. For months, their strength had been wasted on surviving. Now, it was time to reclaim their place in the circle of life. Before setting out, Aina performed a ritual, a quiet one. She traced the shape of the mammoth in soot on the wall, her fingers steady and reverent. "We do not hunt to kill," she whispered, her voice carrying through the chamber. "We hunt to live. We take only what the spirit allows." The tribe murmured in unison, repeating the old chant that bound hunter and prey together in sacred exchange. Even in their hunger, they carried respect, a balance born of understanding that the world gave only what it could and took just as much in return. They set out at dawn, moving carefully through the half-melted snow. The ground was treacherous, soft in some places, still frozen in others. Every step had to be measured. The air smelled of thawing earth and distant smoke. Drek led the way, crouched low, reading the land like a language. The mammoth tracks curved toward the river, where the ice had cracked open into a flowing path of dark water. Steam rose from it faintly, and the sound of rushing current echoed across the valley. When they reached the open plain, they saw them. A herd of 5 mammoths, their massive forms moving slowly through the mist. Their fur was thick and tangled, coated in frost that glittered in the weak sunlight. The largest among them, a bull with curved tusks like the horns of the moon, stood watch at the edge, scanning the horizon for danger. The hunters froze in awe. For months, they had lived on dried scraps and the faint memory of meat. Now, before them stood enough food, fur, and bone to sustain them for many moons. But the sight was not just a gift. It was a test of patience and precision. Rag raised his hand, signaling silence. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would drive the herd toward the narrow pass between 2 frozen ridges, a natural trap where the ground was slick with meltwater. From there, they could corner one of the younger beasts. They moved swiftly into position, spreading out like shadows across the landscape. The air was thick with tension, every heartbeat echoing like thunder in their chests. Drek crept closest, his breath shallow. He held a burning torch in one hand and his spear in the other. When Rag gave the signal, a low whistle, like the cry of an owl, Drek hurled the torch into the wind. It landed near the herd, bursting into a spray of sparks. The mammoths stirred, trumpeting in alarm. Then the hunters moved as one, shouting, waving, throwing stones. The valley came alive with chaos. The great beasts turned, their thunderous feet shaking the ground. Snow and mud flew into the air. The earth itself seemed to tremble. The bull roared, charging toward the noise, tusks lowered. The hunters scattered, their bodies blurs against the white. One young mammoth stumbled on the slick ground, slipping near the ridge. That was their chance. Rag sprinted forward, shouting for Drek. Spears flew through the air, striking the beast's flank. It bellowed in pain and fury, its breath steaming like fire. Drek dodged a sweeping tusk and drove his spear deep into its shoulder. The animal staggered, its massive body swaying. Then, in one powerful moment, Rag leapt forward, thrusting his spear beneath the creature's ribs. The sound was heavy, final, a groan that seemed to shake the air itself. The mammoth fell to its knees, then collapsed, the ground quaking beneath it. The herd cried out, circling the fallen one, then slowly began to retreat into the mist. Silence followed, deep, aching silence. Rag stood over the fallen beast, chest heaving. He placed a hand on its thick hide, feeling the heat fading beneath his palm. "You gave us life," he murmured, "and we will honor you." Aina and the others joined them soon after, carrying offerings of stone and smoke. They burned sage and whispered the words of thanks, their breath mingling with the rising steam. Even in victory, there was sorrow, a recognition of the cost of survival. They worked quickly to butcher the carcass before scavengers arrived. Thick slabs of meat were cut and packed, bones were gathered for tools, and strips of hide were set aside for clothing. Nothing was wasted. Every part had purpose. Drek, his face smeared with ash and sweat, looked toward Rag. "We have enough for many moons," he said proudly. Rag nodded, but his eyes remained distant. "For now," he replied. "The cold always returns." By dusk, the hunters made their way back to the cave, dragging sleds heavy with bounty. The tribe erupted in cheers at the sight. The children ran forward, touching the tusks in awe. Aina lit the great fire in the center of the chamber, and the scent of roasting meat filled the air. It was the smell of triumph, of survival, of life reborn. That night, they feasted for the first time in a season. Laughter echoed through the cavern, songs rose again, and for a brief moment, the endless struggle felt distant. The old ones told stories of past hunts, of ancestors who faced beasts even greater. But when the flames burned low and the songs faded, Rag remained awake, staring into the glowing embers. He knew the thaw brought not only life but change. The world outside was shifting, the ice retreating, the beasts moving north. Nothing stayed forever. As the others slept, he walked to the cave entrance and looked out at the valley, now dark and silent under the moonlight. The stars shimmered above, reflected faintly in the rivers of melting ice. Somewhere out there, the herd was still moving, a reminder that the cycle continued, endless and eternal. Rag closed his eyes and whispered to the night, "We follow where the earth leads." The hunt had given them life, but it had also reminded them of their place, small, fleeting, but part of something vast and sacred. And as the wind shifted through the thawing world, it carried with it the first true promise of spring. Night had fallen deep and full, wrapping the valley in silence once more. Inside the cave, the fire roared brighter than it had in months, its light painting the walls in flickering shades of gold and red. Smoke spiraled lazily toward the ceiling, curling through the cracks of the thawing ice. Around it sat the tribe, tired, full, and alive. Their bodies were heavy with food, their hands still trembling from the thrill of the hunt. But more than anything, their spirits burned with the warmth of something long lost, peace. Aina fed the flames with careful hands, murmuring old words that only the elders still remembered. "Fire listens," she whispered. "It hears the heart of those who keep it alive." To the cavemen, fire was not just heat or light, it was memory. It carried the spirit of the sun when the sky had none. It chased away death and whispered stories of those who came before. When they gathered around it, they were not just keeping warm, they were keeping their world alive. The children curled beside their mothers, tracing shapes on the cave floor with bits of charcoal. The hunters sat close together, their faces lit from below, the firelight dancing in their eyes. Drek leaned back, his laughter echoing through the chamber. "Did you see the beast's eyes before it fell?" he said, grinning. "Like two moons full of fury." The others chuckled, slapping him on the back. Even Rag smiled, a rare, quiet curve of the lips. For once, his heart felt light. Aina began to hum a song then, low, rhythmic, ancient. It was the song of fire and stone, one that had been sung since before words had names. Her voice trembled through the air, slow and hypnotic, like the sound of the wind whispering through trees long gone. One by one, others joined her, their tones weaving into the melody until the cave was filled with harmony. The flames seemed to dance in time, flickering faster as if responding to the rhythm. The song told the story of the first dawn, when the earth was cold and the first people had no fire. It spoke of the one who stole it from the heart of a mountain, who carried it through ice and storm to bring warmth to their kin. The tale was a reminder. Fire was not born of comfort, it was born of courage. And those who tended it carried the same spark within. The children listened with wide eyes, and when Aina's voice softened, the silence that followed felt sacred. Rag rose slowly, holding a burning branch in his hand. He looked around at his people, the tribe that had followed him through hunger, darkness, and despair. "We have fire," he said softly, his voice deep and steady. "We have each other, and as long as both burn, the cold cannot claim us." He planted the branch into the ground beside the main flame, creating two fires that burned side by side. The light doubled, and the walls seemed to come alive with painted forms. Hunters, beasts, stars, and spirits. It was as if the past itself had returned to listen. Drek took up a bone flute, carved with care during the long nights of hunger. He began to play, the notes soft at first, then rising with the wind. The sound filled the cavern, haunting, beautiful, full of ache and hope. The tune spoke of survival, of struggle, of endless winter giving way to dawn. The children began to sway to it, their shadows dancing across the cave walls like spirits in motion. Aina smiled faintly. "When we sing," she said, "the night cannot eat us." The flames crackled louder, and the heat pressed against their faces. Outside, the wind howled, but within, there was only life. The hunters carved pieces of bone and wood as they sat, fashioning new spear tips, beads, and charms. They told stories of the great hunt, of ancestors who spoke to the sky and walked among the spirits of the beasts they hunted. Every tale was a thread that tied them to their past, reminding them that their kind had always endured through cold, famine, and fear. When the songs faded, Aina rose again. She carried a bowl of ash mixed with oil and dipped her fingers into it. One by one, she marked the foreheads of the tribe with a black streak, the mark of the fire keepers. "The cold tried to take you," she said, her voice strong now, "but you burn brighter. Remember this mark, and remember the warmth that you carry within." Even Rag bowed his head as she touched his brow. The mark was not just a symbol of survival. It was a promise that they would not forget what they had endured to reach this moment. Later, when the fire had burned low, they gathered closer. Aina told the younger ones to watch the embers carefully. "Each spark," she said, "is a dream trying to rise." The children stared in awe as the tiny points of light floated upward, fading into the smoky air. "If you dream with your heart," she continued, "the fire will find you, even in darkness." Her words lingered, sinking deep into the silence that followed. Rag sat in thought, watching the last of the flames flicker. The fire had given them life, not just warmth, but meaning. It reminded him that survival was not merely endurance. It was the act of holding on to light when everything else turned to shadow. The tribe had found strength in their unity, courage in their pain, and faith in their stories. They had walked through death and come out carrying the sun. As the last sparks drifted upward, the cave grew dim again, but it no longer felt empty. The fire might die for the night, but its spirit lived in every heart that had gathered around it. Outside, the wind began to quiet, and a faint glow touched the horizon. Rag looked toward it and whispered, "The light returns." Behind him, Aina smiled softly, her voice barely above the crackle of the dying embers. "It never truly left," she said. "We only had to remember how to see it." And in that quiet moment, between fire and darkness, between song and silence, the tribe felt something deeper than warmth. They felt belonging. The world outside was still cold, still vast, still dangerous. But within the circle of fire, they knew who they were. The keepers of light, the singers of the dawn, the ones who had refused to be forgotten by the night. The morning after the great fire, the air carried a strange sweetness, the scent of thawing soil and fresh wind. When Rag stepped outside the cave, the world seemed reborn. The ice that had ruled for so long was breaking apart, surrendering to the warmth of the rising sun. Rivers once frozen now sang again, whispering through the valleys like veins of life returning to the earth. The sky, once gray and suffocating, had begun to clear, showing faint streaks of blue. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, the light didn't hurt his eyes, it soothed them. He called the tribe to gather at the entrance. One by one, they emerged into the light, blinking and shielding their faces. The snow beneath their feet had softened, sinking slightly with each step. The cold still lingered in the air, but it no longer bit, it breathed. Aina stood beside Rag, her fur cloak trailing along the wet ground. "The ice is moving," she said softly. "The land is waking. It will change now, as it always has." Rag nodded, his gaze sweeping across the horizon. The valley stretched wide and open, dotted with pools of meltwater reflecting the sky like fragments of glass. The world that had once trapped them was now calling them forward. For the first time since the long freeze began, they spoke of moving, of leaving the cave behind. Their home, which had sheltered them from death, now felt too small for the living. "There is food beyond the ridges," Drek said, his eyes burning with restless hope. "The herds will follow the thaw. If we follow them, we follow life." Aina agreed, but with caution. The melt brings beauty, she warned, but it also brings floods and hunger. The land remembers both kindness and cruelty. Rag listened to them both, weighing the silence between their words. He knew the truth. Staying meant fading, but moving meant risk. The decision came at dusk. Standing before the fire, Rag spoke to the tribe with the weight of generations behind his voice. "We have survived the dark," he said. "Now we must survive the light. The world beyond this cave is new, but we are not strangers to new worlds. We walk as our ancestors walked, toward the unknown, guided by the sun." There were no shouts of excitement, only quiet nods, eyes full of trust. They began to prepare that very night. The hunters repaired sleds with fresh sinew and bone, tightening bindings and sharpening spearheads. The women packed furs, dried meat, and ember stones wrapped in hides to keep the flame alive. Children gathered bits of charcoal and painted handprints on the cave wall, a farewell to the place that had kept them alive. Aina marked a spiral beside the fire pit, the symbol of life's endless turning. "The cave remembers," she whispered. "It will tell our story to the stones." At dawn they left. The fire was allowed to die naturally, smoke curling into the pale morning sky. Rag led the way, spear in hand, his breath steady. The world outside was vast and strange. The snow was no longer pure white, but streaked with mud and veins of green. The ground was slick, and puddles formed where once there was only ice. Above them, birds returned, calling through the mist. It had been so long since the tribe had heard birdsong that many stopped walking just to listen. Aina smiled faintly. "The sky sings again," she said. "It remembers us." Their journey took them across plains that shimmered with melting frost. Streams cut new paths through the earth, and distant hills glowed faintly in the sunlight. But the beauty of the thaw hid danger. The melting ground was soft and treacherous. More than once, someone slipped into unseen pits of slush. Drek and the hunters moved ahead, testing the way with long poles. "The land is still waking," Rag reminded them. "We must walk as if it dreams beneath our feet." As the day wore on, they came upon the remains of what once had been, skeletons of trees, long buried under ice, now standing half free, their branches reaching toward the sky like hands clawing back to life. The children touched them in awe. "Were they alive once?" one asked. Aina nodded. "Long ago. The same sun that touches us now once touched them too." Her voice carried both wonder and sadness, the recognition that everything that lived must one day fall silent, only to rise again in another form. By midday, they found a ridge overlooking the valley below. From there, they could see rivers winding through the land like silver threads, reflecting the morning light. In the distance, herds of reindeer and bison grazed near the melt line. The sight filled them with joy and hunger. Drek turned to Rag, grinning. "The earth gives again," he said. "The hunt will never end." But Rag's gaze lingered on the horizon, a place where the mountains still shimmered white. "It will end one day," he said quietly. "Everything does, but not today." They descended the ridge and made camp near a stream that ran clear and cold. The hunters built a fire from driftwood carried down by the melt, and Aina crushed herbs she had gathered from beneath thawing roots. The smell of them, sharp, green, and alive, filled the air. That night, they ate together under an open sky.